Hello ladies and gentlemen, and with Ubisoft pulling out of E3, it's left a lot of people with the question, what happens to E3 now? And I found an article called Nobody Wins If E3 Fails, and it was written by Stacey Henley, and it actually has a few good points, a few good conversations that we can have. But before we dig into this article, I just wanted to go through some of my favorite E3 moments. First, we have the Microsoft Kinect reveal. For people that remember that, this took way too long, and it took way too long for Microsoft to showcase what this did, and it also made them look really stupid. Then we have Reggie Fils-Aimé whenever he introduced himself to the world at E3 2004. Now, I am going to recommend you look this up because Reggie Fils-Aimé literally says, "My name is Reggie, I'm about kicking ass, I'm about taking names, and we're about making games." This is one of those moments where a Nintendo employee literally curses on stage. It's kind of funny. Then you have Kevin Butler, who delivered the only real funny conversation or presentation in E3 history, and I highly recommend you look this up. There's also Jamie Kennedy whenever he was a presenter at E3 for, I believe, Electronic Arts is who he was presenting for. You have the Half-Life 2 reveal. You have the Halo 2 reveal that set a new standard for things that went on at E3 in 2003. You also have the reveal of Twilight Princess in 2004. Then you also have the moment where Sony literally almost killed their brand. For some of you that remember this, it's the Ridge Racer moment where they're showing off the PSP. Once again, this is another one of those moments I'm going to recommend that you look up. And the moment that a lot of people talk about, especially whenever you ask them about this, is whenever Sony got on the stage in 1995 and revealed the price of the PlayStation at $299. This is one of those things that happened before me, but I've seen a bunch of clips of it, so if you're interested in that, I highly recommend you look it up. But without further ado, let's just start digging into this article. But I also would like to know, what are some of your favorite instances at E3? Just leave them down in the comments below. Most of what you'll read about the fall of E3 is shot from the perspective of journalists, because it's journalists writing it. We talk about the great memories we have of E3, the friends we caught up with, and the nights at the bar. There's a little bit of talk about the exciting reveals down the years, but even then, it's the random celebrity cameos or the rushing from one hall to the next. These reveals and cameos can be replicated with decentralized events, and the fun of running around breathlessly is very specific to us. Sony isn't going to pay for floor space at E3 just so I can meet up with some buddies for a glass of wine and tell them how I had to play Ghost of Tsushima 2 while dripping in sweat because of my interview with Phil Spencer overran at the other end of the convention hall and I had to sprint to make my session. E3 is a good time, but why should Nintendo pay for us to have a good time? When we discuss E3, we need to think a little wider. The fun times are a consequence of E3, not its purpose, but it's also the only thing that's going away. Sony and Nintendo can make the world stop on their own. Everyone who cares about E3 will also tune in for a state of play or a direct at a moment's notice. It's significantly cheaper for these companies to just host a video stream than to send people to Los Angeles, put them up in hotels, and rent floor space, so that's what they do. They miss out on interview coverage and can't promote their games with hands-on opportunities, but the thinking is that these benefits aren't cost-effective when weighed against the price of attendance. Disappointing but understandable. The reason I think Xbox has failed to commit one way or another is because it badly wants to have the appeal of a direct, but is yet to make it stick. Shadow dropping Hi-Fi Rush and following that up with the Starfield event suggests Xbox is still chasing that rainbow. Now, I'm not trying to be mean to Stacey Henley, but you should do your research, because if you did, you would realize that over 3 weeks ago, Microsoft announced that they will not be attending E3. What we never talk about in all of this are the smaller studios. It's a much bigger risk and larger cost relative to their earnings for these studios to travel to E3 and other events, but at least it's a risk that they can win. The most interesting games I saw at Gamescom last year were Afterimage, Cassette Beats, Ad Infinitum, and Friends vs. Friends. None of these games have studios or publishers that host their own digital showcases or would likely get many viewers if they did. Now, this is a good conversation to have. What happens to all of the indie studios that don't have anyone to really help them promote their game? This is a great question to ask. My response to that is there's plenty of events. PAX East, PAX West, Gamescom. There are plenty of worldwide events that these companies can go to promote their game, and they can also use Twitch to broadcast their game with large Twitch content creators. This is something that everyone will have to adapt to as time goes on. There are so many games these days, but another problem is that there just aren't enough. In the late 90s, Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot, and Final Fantasy were some of the biggest games on the planet. Between 1996 and 2000, we had 5 Tomb Raider games, 3 Crash Bandicoot games, and 2 spin-offs, and 3 Final Fantasy games. Games that take so long to make these days that nothing is as reliable or prolific. We have a lot more studios, but the biggest ones have fewer games. These major studios no longer need centralized events because they don't have a steady enough stream of releases to benefit from them. But the new studios need centralized events because they're too small to make a mark if everyone has to do their own thing. They barely touched how many games were released in that era between 1996 and 2000, so I'm just going to list off some more of the games that were released in that era, so all of you know how many games were being released in that era. Resident Evil, Super Mario 64, Diablo, Pokemon Red, Harvester, Duke Nukem 3D, Ripper, Command & Conquer Red Alert, Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, Super Mario Kart 64, The Neverhood, Phantasmagoria 2, A Puzzle of Flesh, Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game. Grand Theft Auto, GoldenEye 007, Star Wars Jedi Knight, Dark Forces 2, Blade Runner, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Tekken 3, Star Trek Generations, Star Fox 64, Mortal Kombat 4, The Curse of Monkey Island, Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, Resident Evil 2, Metal Gear Solid, The Fifth Element, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Half-Life, Fallout 2, Grim Fandango, StarCraft, Spyro the Dragon, Baldur's Gate, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, Silent Hill, Siphon Filter, Planescape Torment, Super Smash Bros., Dino Crisis, Donkey Kong 64, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, The Legend of Dragoon, Mario Golf, Age of Empires 2, The Age of Kings, Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage, Resident Evil Code Veronica, Command & Conquer, Red Alert 2, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, Diablo 2, Deus Ex, Spider-Man, Perfect Dark, Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Amn, Hitman Code 47, Alice, The Sims. This all opens the door to a conversation of what do you think is going to happen now that E3 is losing power, now that it's not the world phenomenon that it used to be in the 90s and the 2000s, where they had regular coverage on major networks. It's not the same event. But do you think that this is going to end up being bad for the industry, or do you think this is going to end up being good for the industry? I really actually do want to know what people think is going to happen. Like, this is one of those topics that's open to judgment. Like, there are a lot of people who probably believe that this is going to lead to the downfall of a lot of smaller studios and a lot of indie studios, but there are also people that believe that this is going to end up into the industry growing because there's no longer a need for people to end up going to this one centralized event to promote their game. This could end up going either way, but I do actually want to know, and I also want to know, what are some of your favorite memories of E3? I remember whenever I was a kid in the late 90s and throughout the 2000s, E3 was one of those things that you used to watch G4 all day while E3 was going on, just so you can see what the next big games were going to be coming out throughout the year. E3 used to be one of those things that you would mark your calendar and wait for it to happen, and it's just not that event anymore.